Hi, this is Liqian Ren, Director of Modern Alpha Wisdom Tree ETFs. Welcome to China of Tomorrow podcast series, where we navigate China, India, Japan, and the broader emerging markets with members of Wisdom Tree and other industry leaders. Hi, today is October 1st, 2025. This episode will be released in 10 days, so I'll quickly comment on China is on the National Day week off, so the market is closed from October 1st to 8th. So, and usually when Chinese market is closed, sometimes, it becomes a little bit volatile. In the, near term, President Xi and President Trump are going to meet on the sideline of APEC, and China is also trying to stimulate the economy somewhat. I think the National Day consumption data is going to show it's slightly on the warm side. Overall, obviously, it's still cool, but I think people, now that you don't have to save so much money to buy a house, many people actually is opening wallet to travel. But today, I think we're taking the time from the Chinese market break and talk to Miss Anne Stevenson-Yang and her very interesting book. It's called The Wild Ride, a short history of the opening and closing of the Chinese economy. She is I would say, witness of China in the last, 20, 30 years. She has a lot of insights. She co-founded J Capital Research, which publishes diligent research reports on publicly traded companies. Over 25 years living in Beijing, and is an industry analyst. And tell us, what motivated you to write this book?
Let me see what motivated me to write this book. I think it's really a little bit of a sense of sadness, because when I first went to China in 1985, there was so much gestating and being created. There was so much art to see and music, and it was all very small scale, but it was different. China was opening up, and it seemed to provide a lot of promise. And then it began to close down again, and we all kind of, in the early 2000s, everybody sort of accepted that because everybody was getting rich. And so they just so it's a good market, so we won't demand a lot of freedom in the arts. But after the Olympics, it got more and more dark and more depressing. And by the time I left, just before COVID, it just was kind of a depressing place. And it seems sad that the promise of China has not been realized.
Thank you, Anne. I think the interesting thing is, let's review it. And in terms of, closing, probably we'll try to come back and forth because right now I think a lot of people are still, it may have a different view. So let's say, tell us, about what you wrote about the book, like what kind of experiences, you wrote in the book.
Well, when I first arrived in China in 1985, it was a very buttoned up place, and you felt very conspicuous on the street. There weren't a lot of foreigners around. People would come up to me and sort of, talk about me right in front of my face because they assumed that I couldn't speak any Chinese. And they were astonished. If I came out with even one word of Chinese, they'd be astonished, like, oh my God, you can speak Chinese, as if the whole culture and language are so closed and so recondite that it's amazing if anybody else can approach it. So there was, it was, we were very sequestered as foreigners, and people, as foreigners, we got treated sort of with kid gloves. And if you didn't really understand what was going on, it could be flattering, but it was a way of separating people. So if a Chinese person came to visit me, they had to register at the gate, and then a note would go back to their work organization. I had to get permission from my husband's mother to get married, even though he was, fully an adult. And she actually didn't know how to write, so she had to go find her chop, which took like an hour. And I was afraid that she wasn't, going to approve. There were all sorts of regulatory approvals to go through to get married. It was a very rigid place. And then it changed. Initially, for example, in order to buy a washing machine or a refrigerator, you had to have a note from your work organization, and even then, it would be very hard to get. It was a very different society. And then by the late 1990s, it really began to change and move, and things became available, and you had this kind of Beijing streets burst into this cornucopia of food and products and clothing, and everything became so widely available. It was kind of exciting, and kind of the change was very rapid.
So when you were there, what will you mainly do? Like when you were in China?
Well, the first thing I did, I first went over as sort of a foreign expert. I was working as a journalist, and I wrote away to a bunch of magazines and said, "Would you like to hire me?" And one of them said yes. So I just went kind of on a lark. And then the first serious job that I had was representing a U.S. business association, investment association. So that was kind of fun, because I really felt initially like, oh, I failed as a journalist. I'm a terrible person. I'm doing business now. What is business? But then, I'd sit in my office, and these CEOs of American companies would come in and like tell me everything. And I'm like, and I was so ignorant about business. I didn't know what Ford Motor Company was. I didn't know, what an oil drilling company did. I didn't know any of these things. I had paper files on them because we didn't have internet yet. So I'd pull the files and try to read up on these companies and try to sound intelligent. And, back then, all these CEOs were coming to China in order to sort of open up their businesses, and they would have meeting after meeting with various ministries, and their staffs would see, okay, 45 minutes free, let's go see Anne. So they'd come to my office, and they'd like tell me stuff about their business, stuff that you would never learn as a journalist. So it was a great education. Eventually, I got tired of that, and I started a publishing company, which was, difficult and fascinating, and very, very harrying, and took a lot out of me, and eventually sold that, started a software company, which did not do well, and then started an online media company, which was reasonably good, and then started this, J Capital Research, which does research on stocks. So there you go. My whole life in a nutshell.
No, it's really amazing. I think in the sense that when you mentioned about the companies going to China, a lot of it is looking at China's lower wage, and also Chinese government's very welcoming to foreign direct investment in those days. China was in some way, I think if I imagine back 30 years, China at that time was really trying to attract for FDI, because there are a lot of you will say underemployment, in the sense that some people have jobs, but they were not working to their full potential. So and in terms of that, I think I always feel like by working in business, you learn so much more about the person, because when there's real money at stake, people are more honest. So in some way, but can you give us some examples? Like obviously you need to talk about company confidentiality, so you don't have to mention particular company, but some of the examples of the difficulty and the benefits of opening like a company, like starting companies or opening companies for American firms in China.
Sure. So, back in the 1980s, a lot of U.S. and European companies were really, really inefficient, and could get high prices for things like, gravestones and machine tools and, things that were textiles, because there wasn't that much competition, and yet there was a lot of inefficiency in the manufacture. So China, it was kind of a win-win for U.S. businesses and for China, because China wanted more investment, as you said, and there was this sort of effort there was this charm offensive that Chinese officials undertook, where they would make foreign investors feel very special. So, you'd be like the head of a tomato canning plant from Illinois, maybe, right? But when you came to Beijing, you'd be met by ministers, and they would earnestly ask your opinion on big topics like, what should our social security system look like? And you would have your own driver, and you would get a special pay. And so people, felt very, very honored and very special. And all of China sort of mobilized to attract investment. Like, I remember one town I went to in Jiangxi where they actually hung a banner across the street, "Welcome to Japanese investors," because I guess there was a Japanese delegation coming in then. You could get meetings with anybody. You had the phone numbers of ministers on your cell phone. It was just, it was surprisingly welcoming. And for the Americans, it was kind of like, these people in Tianjin can make a gravestone for 40% of the price, including shipping, that they make it for in Georgia. So why shouldn't we do that? The big problem was that the U.S. and European political systems never took those earnings and directed them into Western infrastructure. So that created, or it was a big source of the resentment that later followed.
Yeah, I think just a couple of days ago, President Trump put out a post says he's gonna tariff furnitures, and furniture is probably another industry. Indeed, China kind of become very I wouldn't say dominant, but they did increase significant furniture production, and a lot of those businesses from North Carolina, I would say, they were using Chinese producers, and I think that's the background of what's current the political environment that but on the other hand, and so what I want to understand is that in terms of, I think people really want to understand is the closing of the economy part. Like there are people who are quite positive, and not as a debate, but when people mention China is making progress in technology, it's not too behind. It is behind, but it's not too behind in the US in terms of AI, in terms of drug development. I would say it's probably still quite behind the US, but it's competing with Europe first instead of with the US. So in that sense, how do you say to those people, like when they say, yes, we understand there are a lot of negative things happening in China, but how about the positive things people are seeing? Like how to square them?
Well, you mean you think that the economy is not actually closed, but that technical advance means that the economy is more open?
I think people's point is, a lot of times, I think what people say is that generally, the US is, if you think about it, it's still a closed economy in the sense that literally 90% of GDP is produced in the US. So I think my understanding of closing of the economy is that China is not as welcoming of outsiders, outside capital, and not as open in terms of its economic decision making. But again, we can get your opinion. Like when you mentioned that it's a closing of the economy, like what kind of things you think like shows that it's a closing of the economy?
So I would differ with you about the U.S., but that's not what we're discussing, so we won't go into that. The China, let's put it this way: for many many years, when China came out of the Cultural Revolution period in 1978, it was very underinvested because of all the turmoil that it had been through since 1949, and so it really needed heavy investment in industrial plant and in infrastructure and things like this. And so having an investment-driven economy at that point was appropriate. But China, largely in order to maintain the political control, kept using investment as the tool to make the economy grow for a couple of decades. Now that reached its culmination, and it's especially after going into hyper growth after the crisis of late 2008, that reached its limits in about 2012 when Xi Jinping took over. Then you have a problem, which is that the party relies on being able to direct investment and grow the economy in order to maintain its control, because China is very centralized and the party is able to aggregate capital and direct it, and that's the way that the party maintains its control. In order to accelerate growth and diversify the type of growth and so on and so forth, make it higher quality, the party needs to let go and needs to stop forcing everybody to produce and instead allow people to consume. In other words, a lot of the GDP of China is directed into the hands of owners rather, in the hands of managers, not technically owners, instead of into the hands of the people who are actually making things. The people who are making things are the consumers. So there's a contradiction between relaxing control and economic growth. Because it's very important to the party to remain in control, they've chosen to remain in control rather than to relax control, and that's slowing down economic growth. So remaining in control means making sure that there isn't a lot of lateral communication among people, so that they can't protest if there are price reductions in their housing, or they have trouble finding a job, or their land is seized or something like that. It means having less cultural and artistic expression, or available only to the very top, sort of 1% of the population. It means controlling the amount of foreign investment. It means, and foreign, not necessarily cash, but foreign involvement in the economy. It means that if you're an entrepreneur and you start a little company, the only way it can get big is to cooperate with the state in one way or another. And so in all of these ways and many more, China has become more closed.
Do you feel that like right now actually the situation is worse than in the 1990s or like early 20, I mean like 10, 15 years ago? Like you mentioned that the state, like you mean like I think you're mentioning is that the state's involvement in the economy is actually more strengthened now versus 20 years ago, and that's your way of definition that it's the closing part.
Depends on what you mean by is it worse? Because, obviously the infrastructure development across China has made life better for an awful lot of people. I think that social mobility is reduced, that in the 1990s people could really hope that if they came from a farming community in Jiangxi, for example, then they could make it to university and get a great job in a city center. One of the sort of great errors, I think, in Chinese management is that they have not gotten rid of the hukou system. And so they maintain a system of forcing people to stay where they were born, except under certain exceptional circumstances. Is it more closed than it was? As I say, it depends on who you are and where you sit. Obviously, there's more going on in the economy. But for people at the bottom of the economy, it's probably a little harder to move around.
Thank you. Yeah, actually, I can use myself as an example. I grew up in a village, so I am of the so-called rural residency. And, in China, this residency depends on what your mom has, which is kind of interesting that it goes through the mother line. So my dad was a citizenship, but my mom was not. So me and brother end up as rural. So only by being able to go to college, I was able to become a citizen. On the other hand, I left China right after college, so I didn't really get much benefit out of it. Actually, I probably lost some benefit because the place I grew up in, Zhejiang, becomes really developed. So the rural citizenship in Zhejiang end up was quite some, but that's a very special case for Zhejiang province, which is not the case for the rest of China. And but I think let's probe a little bit more in terms of China. I think many people, when they are investing, well, first I want to understand, like, do you invest in Chinese equity? Like, since you are looking at companies that, when you look at some good and not so good companies, like how do you take your approach to Chinese companies?
Well, I personally don't invest in anything, and our company just does research, and we sell the research to other people, and that's what we do. We don't manage money, but what do I think of Chinese equities? I mean, I think that the incentives for Chinese companies are kind of messed up. So there are lots and lots of fascinating, innovative companies in China, of course, but the companies that get through the pipeline to get listed, in order to do that, you usually have to, pay people off and make a couple of adjustments. I mean, let's say that the rewards for presenting distorted financial statements or inaccurate other statements are very high, and the punishments are very low. So you're naturally going to get a lot of companies that IPO that are not exactly what they say. So China can be quite a dangerous place to invest.
On the other hand, it's also a good place to find an alpha, because if you able to differentiate unless you're saying, most of them are like, but some of the companies, particularly listed outside, in Hong Kong and in the US, I think they generally have a little bit higher standards, than some of and then China's regulative agency actually is very, much on trying. They know the problem, by the way. I think, and just recently, the previous head of CSRC, which is a Chinese Securities and Regulatory Agency, got under corruption charge, which is pretty big. In China, for our listeners, the CSRC head is like SEC head, except it has significantly more power than a US SEC head, who really have a significant say in China's equity market, capital market, not just equity, stocks and bonds. Do you see, like, I think one thing sometimes I myself also struggle as well, because I do see Chinese, some of my friends who are also entrepreneurs who are working very hard and developing new drugs. I have a lot of friends in this area. So they are making some of the good pushes, whether it's domestically or outside China. But on the other hand, I also know there are a lot of frauds in China. Do you feel like, because the Chinese history, as you mentioned, has this thing called circle-ish upwing, in the sense it's like in China, when you become a bit positive, then becomes negative, and when you're negative, it actually shows some positive. In Chinese, it's called 螺旋式上升, which I'm trying to find a way to explain. Essentially, it's kind of
I think
saying
you
like,
might just call it yin and yang, that
yeah,
they're
and
cycles.
yeah, and also the very torturous as an investor on Chinese equities, that you could you have to hold it for very patiently. So I think the question is, I think as one of the big competitor of the US, we have to be very cold eyed in terms of what China can do well and what China didn't do well. So right now, do you still like, because you wrote the book about a year ago, and I think when COVID zero was on, many people really lost hope. I have a lot of friends who turned so negative on China because they feel this thing is going to go forever. But then actually China did open up, and actually was going the opposite so quick and so fast. Nowadays, people almost like kind of forgot that China was under COVID zero, with all those pictures of white, robed testers. And then now I think, if you're looking at so-called crackdown on private businesses, it was indeed quite, I think 2 or 3 years ago, quite serious. But now the government is very careful not to criticize any private business. It's even to the point of almost detrimentous. So in the last couple of days, I think there are a lot of companies which were under social media pressure. Like one of the restaurant, Xibei, which was they were selling their food, like many restaurant food are kind of pre-made, right? Like frozen food on the side, heated, but they were selling it at a high price and selling it as freshly made. And then now it was under huge pressure, and it's not yet clear whether they could suffer through the weather of storm of the consumers. In many times, the government is becoming loath to criticize any private businesses for fear of being labeled as bad on private business. So you see these huge swings. Like, do you now, like after 1 year, seeing what you're seeing, do you still would you still draw the same conclusion that China, the economy is on the closing side, or you have a slightly changed opinion?
I have not changed my opinion. I do think, obviously they're back and forth and ups and downs and pockets of change. I don't think it's fair to say that we had three years, I guess, of people not being allowed to leave their homes, people getting bricked into their houses. I mean, people getting, children dying in fires because they weren't allowed to leave, people dying in earthquakes because they couldn't leave their compounds, people being refused medical attention. It's really just not fair to say that because it ended, that it didn't matter. But at any rate, setting that aside, I think about this quite a lot because I would like to go to the mainland. I have a lot of friends and relatives there. And every now and then, you'll get this spate of kind of random arrests of people visiting China. And then a lot of other people will go and come out, and you think, well, maybe it's, maybe I was too overwrought about this. But then somebody else gets arrested. It's very, it's unreliable. These things don't change because I don't think it's about trends. I think it's about the management system, and the party system is just bad. And therefore, it's unreliable whether you're going to get detained, for example, if you go to China, whether the business environment is going to be good or bad. Obviously we can say plenty about other countries, but in China, I think it is unreliable to invest there and visit there as a foreigner.
Thank you. In terms of in China, I think right now it's actually I'm not saying like actually it is trying to attract foreign capital. If you look at China, FDI, foreign direct investment has gone really dramatically down, partly for the reason you mentioned. On the other hand, China, out of surprise for many, decided to give visa-free like for 1 month. You don't need visa for many countries now. Most of the European countries, Southeast Asian countries like Malaysia, Indonesia, and the Central Asian countries. So it is given that the party system is still going to be there, and in any near term, I don't think it will go away. There are still things that the party is doing to try to open up China for foreign people. And also, just last couple of days, there was a huge debate about this K visa, which the government actually it's starting effective today. Wants to attract under age 45 tech workers. You don't need an invitation of a company to go to China, but domestically, you have this huge wave of people who actually against this visa for worry of taking jobs because the unemployment rate is high. So in some way, the party is also navigating. So the way the party works is set some goals and then try to work toward it. And the economic goals are still there. Do you feel that for the party is still, even though it is true that it realized the COVID was a huge damaging experience, it's possible to swing toward a bit more opening because it realized how negative that episode was.
Yeah, there's a lot embedded in that. Obviously, it is possible to swing this way and that way. What I'm saying is that our views are fundamentally different because I believe that the administrative structure, and this goes to your earlier point about how you think that China is innovating now and has innovative technologies. I think that the system is broken. So if you manage, it's not to say that Chinese people are not innovative or that there isn't good technology that comes out of China, but if you manage it bureaucratically, then you don't get good results in the end. And I think the same is true of how investment is treated. And yes, there are swings back and forth, and people get anxious and say, "Oh, well, let's have this new type of visa." That doesn't mean that a lot of people are going to go in and invest. Let's just take the example of banking, which, as we know, is a very rigid sector. So it's been 23 years since China formally agreed that foreign banks could come invest in China, and the foreign banking share of China's banking sector has declined quite significantly. So, is that openness or not openness?
Yeah, I actually on that I very much agree. I think China's financial industry is still very closed. Actually, if you look at the state ownership in financial industry, it's still so dominant by the government entities, and we'll see. Actually, if you look at some of the subtle points, is that finance that used to be considered I think a couple of months ago there was this Chinese saying, it's called the mouse running on the street, like 过街老鼠. Because finance historically the party is viewed as very capitalist. It's the capitalism. The capitalists are, the bankers are the most capitalist. So recently in some of the documents, it does have this a little bit, I think a turn that, realizing that finance is an important industry and also probably helps to open up. So for example, I think Bridgewater, right, even though it's U.S. operation, says that they are not, putting significant weight on China. They sold their China equity stuff, but they have one of the largest private fund in China. They manage, billions in China. So in terms of, you're right, in terms of banking, it's not as open, but it could be that maybe again, this is something which we have to observe, trust but verify whether there could be some opening in some of the capital market instead of banking. Because if you look at the Stock Connect and Bond Connect, you do see Chinese the government is more open to have other players coming in those areas. Now that remains to be seen, but that's one thing which I was kind of observing the recent, the government recent announcements.
Yeah, so China has always been sort of a roach motel for capital. So you can go in, but you can't come out. So sure, there are always, whenever the central government thinks that it wants foreign capital, then there will be some opening that allows capital in, but getting that capital out again can be a problem. So, it's sort of interesting in many countries that have pieces of industry that are nationalized, or have let go of national industries, have kept the industries that do not make money, but release the industries that do make money to the private sector. China has been just the opposite. So the profitable sectors, telecom, banking, gas and oil, these sorts of things have been held closely by the government. And no foreign or private capital has been allowed in, or only on the nibbling along the edges. Whereas the money losing sectors, everybody is welcome to invest in. That has not been a great story for efficiency or for the private economy. But I don't think it's particularly useful to talk about communism or capitalism anymore, any ism. I think it's just useful to talk about the structure of an economy.
Yeah, I agree. This is really interesting. For our listeners, the book is called Wild Ride, a short history of the opening and closing of the Chinese economy. And you can also check out Anne's website, J Capital Research. And like, aside from people who can read the book and try to understand, your point of view more, do you have anything else that you can share with our listeners?
Like what other type of thing?
Yeah, like what the things in your book or things that I missed.
Like what should people read or do in order to understand China? I don't know. I mean, I think my favorite book on politics, which doesn't really touch on China, is called A Dictator's Handbook, and it's about how political structures start to shift and become to the benefit of the top owners and the people who control them. And it doesn't have anything to do with communism, capitalism, socialism, or whatever ism you choose. It just has to do with the nature of political institutions.
Thank you. Yeah, that's I should definitely check that book as well. I myself have been reading a lot of history. I feel that there's so much similarity and also reassessment of history. Like recently, I'm not sure, since you went in Beijing, I also went to Peking University. So one of the president of Beijing, Cai Yuanpei, for people familiar with China history, he's usually very well regarded. His statue is on the campus of the the campus, and I walk by him, every day when I was studying there. But now that I'm reading more about, the kind of people he actually got to teach at the university, many of them, I would say, they are much more political radicals instead of, serious researchers. And, my view of him, somewhat, he lost a lot of shine in my eyes, that, he used to be considered really the, like one of the prestigious Chinese university presidents, right? But now that I read more about the history, I kind of have second opinions, and I think sometimes reading history helps me in terms of understanding how the structure of things work. So thank you so much. Again, thank you, and thank our listeners. We'll be back and talk more about China and its companies.
All right. Well, thank you for having me.